Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I think it's 9:30. For some reason, yes, it is. For some reason, the clock up there says 0. It's definitely not 0. But I hope that's not an ominous sign. For those who don't know, I'm Matt Rojansky, director here at the Kennan Institute. This is what I've been doing a lot of sort of ceremonial welcomes at some of the concerts and social events we've had over the last few days. But when we do public events, I always start with housekeeping. So just some housekeeping. Next Thursday at 3:30, we have another event coming up, which is actually a very special series we have launched in honor of the founding director of the Wilson Center, and one might say the founding scholar of Russian cultural history in America, Jim Billington. So this will be the Billington Seminar on Russian History and Culture next week, Thursday, 3:30. The title is Reconceptualizing the Russian Legal Tradition, Imperial Roots and Modern Reality. And the panel will talk about issues like citizenship, the practice of law in the everyday context, sovereignty, the adversarial process, legal pluralism, from both a historical and contemporary perspective. The Billington Initiative, of which this is part, was established last year by several private donors in honor of Jim Billington, who of course has just retired as Librarian of Congress. And it includes the naming annually of an up-and-coming scholar in the field of Russian cultural history, who this year is Rosalia Garipova, in fact, the first inaugural Jim Billington Fellow. And so she'll present on the panel along with Professor Jane Burbank from NYU and our own Will Pomerantz. So next week, 3:30, I hope you can join us for that. Today's conference, as everyone no doubt knows, and I'll flash my cool program here, is the 100-year legacy of the Russian Revolution in the world today, how the revolution divided, unified, and shaped a continent. This is the launch of a year-long project, which is an international, multinational project that we've undertaken with several partners, looking at the legacy across the board of the 1917 revolution. So we had a kind of private component of the conference already yesterday among just some of the absolute leaders in this field, some of whom are still here, which was really fascinating, and it was particularly rewarding, I think, for me, not only because I had very little work to do in pulling us all together. That was thanks largely to my colleague Isabella and to our partners, whom I'll thank in a moment, but because I got to see something that we are charged with doing in our charter as a congressionally chartered national memorial to Woodrow Wilson, and of course the Kennan Institute, bringing policy-relevant expertise on Russia and the region to Washington. But I actually got to see how an event of 100 years ago can be conceptually, morally, socially, politically, economically, doctrinally, I mean, every other way, very, very relevant to this present moment. And I strongly suspect, in fact, I know for sure, because we have charged our speakers with this, today's panel will bring that out as well. But before we begin, I want to thank our sponsors and partners, the Nadav Foundation, our generous sponsor, and our two partner institutions, the Leonid Nevzlin Research Center for Russian East European Jewry at Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Poland Museum of Jewish History in Warsaw. We are very much looking forward to the next components of this effort, which will, of course, take place in Warsaw and Jerusalem, and to our other partnerships going forward. So we have two star-studded panels today, of which I have the privilege of opening the first, which is titled, Why Study the Russian Revolution Today? So I was going to answer that question that I posed earlier. The Russian Revolution, of course, was critical in defining the 20th century. In fact, historians, as I'm sure we'll hear today, tend to define it as the beginning of the so-called short 20th century. And its legacy is still very much evident among diverse diverse populations, not only on the European continent, but internationally. And we saw this wonderfully illustrated in a concert that we held last night. The music of the revolutionary diaspora, in particular in Israel, but even in South America, it was just incredible. And it sort of explains why, actually, my dad is from Israel, and I grew up with all these melodies that were then weirdly familiar when I started listening to, like, Russian World War II marches. Just the words were different. So joining us to debate these and many other questions will be, and we'll speak in this order. I'm going to introduce everyone briefly now, and then we're just going to go kind of very short 5 to 7 maximum minute openings from each of our speakers, so we preserve plenty of time for discussion. Zvi Gittelman is professor at the University of Michigan, where he studies ethnicity and politics, especially in former communist states, as well as Israeli politics, East European politics, and Jewish political thought and behavior. Ivan Kurila is a professor at the European University in St. Petersburg. His primary field of interest is the history of U.S.-Russia relations, especially in the 19th century, in the antebellum and Civil War periods. And I should note he's a former chair of the Kennan Alumni Council and one of our most active alumni in Russia. Sergei Plokhy is the Mikhail Hrushevsky Distinguished Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard and Director of Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. His research interests include the intellectual, cultural, and international history of Eastern Europe, with an emphasis on Ukraine and an emphasis on James Bond-like spy stories, I think, based on his most recent book, The Man with the Golden Gun. Dariusz Stola is a historian, professor at the Institute for Political Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences, as well as a fellow at the Center for Migration Research at Warsaw University. And since 2014, he's been the director of the Polin Museum, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. So you have full bios in the information sheets. As I said, we're going to keep the introductory remarks short. We'll go in this order, and then we're going to open it right away for questions. So thank you, everyone. Zvi, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here, and I thank the sponsors. I'm going to focus on a few long-term consequences of the Bolshevik Revolution in order to highlight how the revolution of a century ago continues to cast its shadow on later and even contemporary perceptions and events. The first thing I think that happened regarding the East Central European region was that countries which had historically bad relations with Russia became even more hostile because of their revulsion against Bolshevism. And that was added to and compounded by the hostility based on perceived national interests. Remarkably, the association of Russian or communist repressiveness with Russia lingers to this day, even among regimes that have themselves become more repressive than they were when communism fell. In Poland, Hungary, Romania, and the Baltic states, the historic traditional Russian enemy became an ideological threat as well. It was private property versus collectivism, communism versus Christianity, national virtues versus internationalist or cosmopolitan values. Communism no longer reigns in Russia or anywhere else in Europe, but there are many in East Central Europe who feel that communism was such a traumatic experience with such long-term deleterious effects that it needs to be discussed. And if you visit in Budapest, for example, the so-called House of Terror, if you read Russian and Polish books or other books about the experience of communism, if you look at the Prague Declaration, there seems to be a feeling that communism has not been criticized enough, that while fascism is universally condemned, communism has not received the kind of criticism that fascism has. Of course, there are fears in Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states that Russia itself remains a state with imperialist ambitions. There's a third factor in the revulsion against the Bolshevik Revolution, not just historic hostility between the states, not just communism as an alien and oppressive ideology, but something that, at least from my perspective, can be summarized in the myth of the Żydo-komuna, that communism was a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. And this becomes a modern basis for anti-Semitism, more powerful in the area where Christian doctrine long was a basis for a hostility towards Jews. Factually, there was very little basis for this myth. I'll put it this way. Jews were overrepresented in the communist parties, almost all of them secret, in Eastern Europe. Communists were hardly visible in the Jewish populations of Eastern Europe. In other words, while maybe a quarter of the underground Polish Communist Party were of Jewish origin, the 12,000 or 15,000 Polish Jewish communists were among 3,350,000 Polish Jews. So why the myth? I think the primary reason was the extraordinary visibility of Jews in the Bolshevik leadership. Lev Davidovich Bronstein, Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Uritsky, others, Sverdlov. This happened in a country where Jews could not be police officers or postmen or any civil servants until 1917, and now they wielded power and vigorously threatened the established domestic and international orders. I think the only analogy might be if in 1950 an African American lesbian had become the governor of Mississippi. This was a reversal of the natural order. This was a departure from a normalcy that had to be restored. And to root out communism, you had to punish the Jews for having brought it on. So during the Civil War period, 1918-1921, at least, most conservative estimate is that 50,000 Jews were killed by a variety of forces, among whom there was not much of a common denominator except Be Żydów spasaj Rosji, beat the Jews and save Russia. 2 decades later, in 1939-41, clearly non-Orthodox, non-Zionist, and young Jews welcomed the arrival of the Red Army as liberators in eastern Poland, in Bessarabia and Bukovina, and certainly in Latvia and Lithuania. And that provided the rationale for pogroms, which broke out on the eve of the Holocaust, to wit, in places like, now we know, of course, Jedwabne, Radziłów, Szczucin, Lviv in Poland, Kaunas in Lithuania, towns in Romania, Iași, and other places. There were spontaneous attacks not organized by the Nazis against the Jews, and the rationale was revenge on the Jews for having taken away the liberty, the sovereignty, the independence of these states because the Jews were communists and the communists were Jews. Now these grassroots murders, which amounted to, even just in Lviv, probably 3,000, in Kaunas, or in Lithuania in general, 3,000, these grassroots murders have been eclipsed in public memory by the massive and systematic annihilation of Jews during the Holocaust, which itself was justified by the Nazis, beginning with Hitler and going all through the ranks, that the war in the Soviet Union was not a war against the communist ideology alone, but against its Jewish bearers. So it was a dual war on the Eastern Front against Judeo-Bolshevism and against the Soviet Union. And even today, Jews are blamed for the miseries of communism by some in the area. I think it's pretty clear, but we have to add, that Jews were like many other have-nots, people who had been repressed before 1917, who both benefited and suffered from the Bolshevik Revolution. Think about the peasantry. Think about people who gained literacy. So the standard of living of the peasantry may have risen, but what, 8 million were killed during the process of collectivization? Jews may have become 13% of all students in higher education by 1927, when they were less than 2% of the population. But what happened to Judaism, Hebrew, and Zionism? So in a way, it stands for the summation of what the Bolshevik Revolution brought to the peoples of the Soviet Union. Finally, it's worth noting that most East Central European states have joined the EU and or NATO. They have not become full-fledged democracies, none is a Russian ally, and none of the quasi-dictatorships embrace communism. By the end of the 20th century, communism seems to have ended, and in doing so, it propelled several mass migrations, and that's the last point I want to make. Those who fled the Soviet Union between 1918 and 1924, migrations of millions in the course of World War II and its aftermath, the Hungarian emigration, the Polish emigration, the Czechoslovak emigration, and I think we should reassess the role of anti-communist immigrations in the formation of other states' relations, including the United States, with the USSR, and the shaping of the image of communism in America and Europe. A prominent Russian academic, at one time Minister of the Nationalities, wrote in one of his massive books that American foreign policy was conditioned by the Jewishness of the emigres, professors Kissinger and Brzezinski. I wrote to my mentor, Professor Brzezinski, and I asked him about it, and he said he'd been accused of worse things. So, as the Bolsheviks had confidently predicted in 1917, the revolution transformed the world, but not in the long term in the way that they had predicted.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, organizers, for getting me here. As Matt already announced that my major field is the history of Russian-American relations, and I want to stress that the event of the revolution, Russian Revolution, event that happened in Russia 100 years ago, did shaped not only the destiny of Russia, and we cannot understand anything in Russia or in Eastern Europe today without addressing the events of that period, but we cannot also understand the contemporary United States as they were. The United States was also shaped by the events in Russia 100 years ago, and probably we underestimate that influence. I will try to put several points on that. First of all, Russian Revolution, especially Bolshevik coming to power, produced an alternative ideal for the rest of the humankind. Before that, for a century and a half, American liberty, American democratic ideal was the only visual future for the rest of the humankind. And all of the revolutionaries and reformists in Europe modeled themselves according to American ideal. And this is 1917 was the year when another ideal appeared in the end. It was a very attractive appeal, attractive ideal for several decades, and many countries outside of, even in Europe and mostly outside of Europe and Asia, Africa, and even Latin America, did wanted to try this alternative way of development. And that appearance of an alternative ideal made American society, American political elite to adjust themselves to this competitive nature of the leadership. And that was a very different position that the United States needed to take during these 100 years. And America did change itself according to the needs of this competition, and needed to embellish, to focus on those parts of American social life, American political system, which can be portrayed as a more attractive than Russian way of Soviet way of life. And that's why we have many programs in the United States which probably would not be so developed if there is no competition, there is no ideological competition with the Soviet Union. The other, very connected, but the other point to the same thought is that the influence of immigration from Russia, from the Soviet Union to the United States. The first waves of immigration after the revolution, the first wave of revolutionary immigration brought to America not only engineers and people like Sikorsky, who became one of the leading helicopter producer here, or people like Zworykin, who was one of the pioneers on television, and some other people like Ponetov, inventor of video recorder. We have a long list of those Russian engineers who emigrated, but and people on the other hand, who who emigrated before the revolution but influenced American culture. But there are also people who influenced an American, we say, ideology, ideological scene. And the most visual person I want to name now is Alice Rosenbaum. You probably know her on her pen name Ayn Rand. She immigrated from St. Petersburg, from Petrograd, already in the 20s. She ran away from the radical Bolshevik regime, and when she arrived to the United States, she became one of the leading writers of the right-wing conservative tradition, and she actually invented the morality for the capitalism. Somebody, I guess, told that she taught us that capitalism was not only efficient, but it was also moral. And that was an important part. Without Russian experiment, without those people who ran away from the Russian Revolution, Americans probably would never thought that their capitalism may be described as a very moral way of life. And this is, high morality. And this is also important. And of course, the technological race. Because of the Cold War especially, because of the competition, both countries try to develop those part of the science, those part of engineering that would probably not come first without this type of competition. We can blame the Cold War for many bad things, but we also did the space research because of the Cold War. We had a lot of new technologies developed because of those competition, and it's also shaped America. So without this, without the Soviet Union, without the Russian Revolution 100 years ago, the United States today would be a very different country. And I would say that's why, answering the question and the title, that's why we need to study the Russian Revolution. Thank you.
Fantastic. By the way, Ivan, since you brought it up, I'm a car nut, and in my list of important Americans who shaped this country, of course, is Zora Arkus Duntov, who was the inventor of the Corvette. Sorry.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and when I was invited to take part in this panel, we had a discussion with Isabella why to study Russian Revolution. My immediate response was, why not? And but I have a more maybe more complex answer to this question now. And what I will try to propose in my 5 minutes is that the Russian Revolution, among many other things, created what we know today as modern Russian nation, or rather the process of the creation of the modern Russian nation started in 1917. This process is not over yet. And what I will do, I will try to go through different stages in the way how the modern idea of Russianness was born in the flames of the revolution and how it evolved. In particular, in relation to its contacts with other Eastern Slavs. So that's the overall framework of my presentation. There is probably no more important, though convoluted and often confusing term for understanding Russian history than Russian Revolution. To start with, there were two revolutions in the same year. The February 1917 overthrow of the Tsarist government and the October 1917 takeover of state power by Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks. As if that were not enough, the dates of those two revolutions were usually given according to the ancient Julian calendar used in the Russian Empire. However, according to the Georgian calendar adopted in the former imperial territories in 1918, they took place respectively in March and November of 1917. Then there is an issue of chronology. Under the capacious umbrella of the Russian Revolution, historians usually include the civil war in Russia and the international conflicts within the former imperial borders that took place from 1917 to 1921. And some scholars extend the term to a good part of 1920s or even the entire Soviet period. And last but not least, the confusion over the term Russian Revolution in its part when it comes not to the revolution but to Russian. How Russian was the Russian Revolution? And many scholars, of course, put emphasis not just on the revolutionary developments in the Russian periphery, like in Volga regions, for example, but also in the non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn, of course, famously blamed the Russian Revolution on Trotsky and Jews. So that's one more component of this contested Russianness within the Russian Revolution. I want to add to the general confusion with this term by putting one more layer of complexity, and this is thinking about Russian in again relation to the larger East Slavic its Slavic body of the population of the Russian Empire in 1917. So before 1917, the Russian meant actually belonging not to the Great Russian group, but to the East Slavs in general, including today's Ukrainians or Belarusians, Little Russians or White Russians. And one of the most numerous organizations of the Union of the Russian People, Союз Русского Народа, were in Volhynia in Ukraine on the border with Poland and, of course, the areas with very significant Jewish presence at the same time. And it was only in the course of the revolution that this idea of the three-partite pan-Russian nation really started to fall apart. And the idea of Great Russians as a separate group, separate from other East Slavs, not just from the Uzbeks or from the Jews or from the Poles, start to emerge. Again, it's a complex process that took good part of the 20th century, and as I said, it's not over till today. We hear again and again people like Vladimir Putin saying Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. So the process of separation, at least in rhetorical terms, in emotional terms, is not over yet. And this issue, among other issues, are also now decided by the Russo-Ukrainian war and conflict in eastern Ukraine. So what really happened, and how did this idea of Russianness or Great Russianness, separate from the rest of the East Slavic group, came to existence? When one of the champions of that idea in 1917 was nobody else but Vladimir Lenin. It worked very nicely for him once he was in the opposition. He had to figure out what that would mean once he came to power. But in general terms, for the purposes of the keeping control of a post-imperial space, he and Bolsheviks around him were faced with the two different alternatives and two challenges. One of them was, of course, the mobilization of the nationalism in Ukraine, partially in Belarus, but mostly in Ukraine, that they had to deal somehow with that and accommodate that. On the other hand, the idea of the pan-Russian nation was really on the banners of the White Army and Volunteer Army and the opponents of the Bolshevik regime. So at the end, it's Lenin's Bolsheviks that come with this formula of recognition de jure, if not de facto, the existence of the separate East Slavic ethnic groups, apart from Russians, also Ukrainians and Belarusians, and their state bodies, communist parties, and so on and so forth. But the key moment really in terms of the institutionalization of the Russian identity as separate from imperial identity and pan-Russian identity comes in 1922 with Lenin's victory over Joseph Stalin in their debate on how the Soviet Union should be organized and constructed. Because it's not only about the fact that Lenin insisted that, let's say, the North Caucasus or Belarus or Ukraine would have republics of their own that would join on equal Russian Federation, or formally on equal terms in the Soviet Union, but it was for the first time that we see creation for the Russians, a separate territory, separate institutions. Again, it's their relationship with these institutions, it's still very confusing whether it's Moscow is the center of the Union, but also Moscow is the center of Russia. But it's there in 1922, first in 1917 and then in 1922, that the idea that the Russian Federation is something different from the Russian Empire or doesn't necessarily include Kiev start to emerge. And again, these tendencies were strengthened in the 1920s in the process of Korenizatsiya, in the process of support of non-Russian, development of non-Russian cultures. in the peripheries of the empire. So when we talk about what some scholars call Great Retreat of the 1930s and return to the models associated with the pre-1917 Russia under Stalin, with return of the Christmas tree, for example, and a different name, and so on and so forth, and return of Russocentrism in the Russian propaganda, in the Soviet propaganda at that time in the 1930s, it's a different kind of Russia that comes back now. It's not Russia of pre-1917 with this pan-Russian idea of uniting all East Slavs, but it's actually the modern notion of Russia that comes to the fore and then very much dominates the rest of the Soviet history. It changes after 1917. It changes after 1917 with many of the pre-1917 ideas of nationhood, the importance of religion, the importance, I don't know, the figure of Nicholas II suddenly becomes important for new Russian identity. And among those transfers from pre-1917 Russia is also the idea of the pan-Russian nation with the statements like Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. So these are statements. When we look at the war on the ground, at the conflict on the ground, what we see is that the territory settled mostly by, where the majority are ethnic Russians, which would be Crimea, becomes part of the Russian Federation. But the territory settled by Russian speakers, like Donbass, is actually left in a limbo, and again, we don't know what will happen there. So the process of the formation of the Russian nation and understanding what Russia is not in territorial terms, in cultural terms, in ethnic terms, is not over yet. But the beginnings of all of that are really in the revolution of 1917. And so maybe I would study the revolution, the history of the Russian Revolution, even just for that one particular factor. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Well, I'm very glad I have a chance to speak on this panel, though speaking as the last one. I could complain that most of my points have been already exhausted. I'd be very happy that I don't have to deal into details, but build on the work of my predecessors. Let me start first with the distinction between what the Russian revolutions of 1917 have begun or ended, because they certainly ended the great Russian empire of the Romanovs. I mean, both the Tsarist regime and the huge transcontinental empire that the Romanov dynasty had built for the previous several hundred years, which included a large part of Central and Eastern Europe between the Baltics and the Black Sea. And I will speak from a perspective of Central European. What did it mean for Central Europeans? So whatever the outcome would be, important was that the old regime was gone, firmly gone. And then Russia set on the downward spiral of self-destruction in the civil war, which greatly contributed to the capacity of states like Lithuania, Poland, or Finland to get independence and certainly define the eastern borders with this new weak Russia, future Soviet Union. So without the negative aspect of the revolution, the destruction of the old empire, it would certainly have been impossible to establish the series of nation states between the Black Sea, the Baltic, and the Adriatic. However, it coincided, of course, with the collapse of several other empires, primarily the Habsburg one, the decline of the Kaiser Germany, and much farther in the south, the Ottoman Empire, which coincidentally collapsed at the same time. So we have a broader replacement of an imperial order of multi-ethnic empires with a series of much smaller nation states, which was of course very good for the national movements, which at that time, the national movements which were not very old at that time, maybe a generation old, they started in the late 19th century, they were victorious. However, they were only to make Polish peasants into the Poles, or Lithuanian peasants into Lithuanians. That was only ahead of them. And probably it was not completed before the German occupation. It was finally Adolf Hitler, which made Polish peasants Poles by the persecution of ethnic Poles. So by the rejection of the Bolshevik state of Russia, or by following it later on when the Soviet army came back at the end of the Second World War, the fate of Central Europe for most of the 20th century was defined by what did happen in Russia than the Soviet Union. And I use the case of the town of the city of Białystok, which is telling that the Bolshevik revolution, the communist regime was coming 3 times in 3 different settings. First was in 1920 with the advance of the Bolshevik army, which was at that time going to reach Germany, to reach German comrades and spread the revolution to Western Europe with highly universalist slogans. And it was stopped in 1920 at the gates of Warsaw in summer of 1920 because my great father, who was a peasant, decided he rather was a Polish peasant and Christian than an oppressed proletarian who wanted liberation from the hands of landlords by the Bolshevik army, and millions of them did the same. Then the communist regime came back in a highly unexpected way as an ally of Nazi Germany in 1939 after the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And it came by the annexation to the new Belarusian Republic. Białystok became a Belarusian city, to the big surprise, I think, to most of the inhabitants. It may be a Belarusian city. Including the Jewish half of it. That was short-lived and highly violent. I mean, the mass deportations, the destruction of the previously dominating classes, terror, arrests, and killing marked this period. But it was short-lived. And I would say that the Soviet terror of 1939 to 40 was mild comparing to what the Nazis brought in since the summer of 1941 to this population, and not only Jewish population. It was kind of course, as Tvigitelman said, the Holocaust started exactly in this area. It started as an attack on the Soviet Jewry, and it started also with the local spontaneous pogroms. So there was a lot of local hatred in this area. But later on, the German terror affected the population at large. And finally, for the third time in 1944-45, the victorious Soviet army marching towards Berlin brought the Soviet-style regimes to all of Central and Eastern Europe. And so it remained for the next 40 or 40-something years. And this leads me to a contemporary reason to study Russian revolution, because the arguments we have heard was something important happened in the area of the former Russian Empire, which affected many countries, including this country. And I would like to stress that the new Central Europe, the Central Europe which is rightly proud of dismantling communist regimes some 28 years ago, in 1989, 1990, has been built in the opposition to the communist regimes. And there has been a tendency, which I think is wrong, in externalizing the causes, the dynamics of the communist regime, making it exogenous. I mean, it was brought on the Soviet tanks. It is true, without Soviet tanks, it wouldn't have happened. However, there was an endogenous factor to the communist regime. There was a massive participation in the communist parties, and there were more reasons than the violence alone to support the communist regimes. So it's cheap to externalize it on the Russians and possibly the Jews, kind of a Judo-Russian Bolshevik plot. Russian nationalists put on the Jews alone. It's difficult. So it's easier in Central Europe to put it on the Russians and on the Jews. So first, it's cheap. Second, it's inaccurate. And second, it misrepresents the social dynamics of the revolutionary movements. And there were revolutionary movements even without the Bolshevik and then Soviet presence in Central and Eastern Europe, just to mention the relatively short-lived but successful revolution in Hungary, in parts of Germany, and also the first independent Polish government in 1918 was a socialist government. Then the next governments of Poland adopted fairly radical agrarian reform just to responding to the relatively successful Bolshevik propaganda addressed to the peasants. So in responding to the Bolshevik threat, Central and Eastern European governments, even while they were highly anti-communist, were guiding their policies. So externalizing it on Russians, ethnic Russians, and the Jews alone is a mistake, and it misrepresents, it prevents us from understanding of the nature of the communist regime throughout the 50s, 60s, up to the 1989, which is not just to make Poles and Lithuanians and Hungarians wrongly believe they were innocent. It's not just about the innocence, it's about the understanding of the dynamics of resentment tensions between those who, the haves and have-nots and various minority groups. By the way, not only the Jews were overrepresented in the Polish Communist Party, also Belarusians and Ukrainians were also overrepresented. So that was a minority movement. I'm not sure there will be many people following my way of argumentation and trying to learn more about the Russian Revolution. It's strikingly absent. Before coming here, I was trying to find out how many conferences do we have in Poland this year on the Russian Revolution. I have found one, except the one we organize. So there are two of them. In a country which fate was defined by the Russian Revolution for most of the 20th century. So maybe my way of reasoning is reactive, not to say reactionary. I want to compensate for the oblivion of something important that defined the 20th century in Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Wow. Well, that was phenomenal, all four of you, and more importantly, you actually followed directions. So we have plenty of time for discussion, and that means I get to ask you this very, I think, loaded and controversial question, which is, you know, for the most part, not 100%, for the most part, you sort of took your analyses up through World War II and sort of into the post-war period, but I would like to invite you to say a little bit more about this exact moment right now, this acute moment exactly 100 years later, when it seems to me, again, I admit that it's a loaded question, feel free to argue with the premise, that if you strip out the Bolshevik ideology and some of the extreme means of the establishment of this communist project after 1917, that some of the trends that we saw, which some of you mentioned, right, the sort of nominal free association of peoples, a set of values which was, again, nominally universalist, a kind of pooling of resources, right, to develop regions which were underdeveloped, you know, at the expense of other regions, even a multi-speed aspect to the Union. What do these things sound like? Well, they kind of sound like the European project of today. And again, I'm not trying to brand that as sort of the new Bolshevism, but there is a backlash against it, which also has some strikingly familiar tones, including against Mr. Soros, which has a certain ethnic overtone to it, against Russians, which is an irony, of course, because Putin's Russia is very anti-EU, or has been. So I guess the real question I have, aside from inviting you to argue with my premise, which is probably silly and artificial, the real question I have is, what advice do you have for those who are, you know, seeking to advance and preserve, exactly 100 years later, a big intellectual, political, economic, and moral project across this same European space, which is very clearly generating a lot of backlash? Anyone want to take up that challenge? We believe in the premise here that students of history, in fact, do have something to offer to contemporary policymakers, so prove me right. Please.
I, without being a Marxist and believing in deterministic dialectic, I think that many movements, including the Bolshevik, which had projected values which many people would accept, at the same time, in the way they projected those values, and certainly in the way that they implemented them, did so in such perverted, extreme fashion that the inevitable reaction was not only to reject the ways in which those values had been projected, but to reject those values themselves, to be a little bit less obscure and to wade into very dangerous territory. I do have a plane at 2 o'clock, so I feel a little bit protected. One might say that, at least in this country, the dramatically inflammatory ways in which some of the liberal values have been expressed by some make it easy for those who oppose those values ab initio to point to the expressions and to attack not only the expressors and the expressions, but the very values themselves. So I think we have a rabbinical saying which says, Chachamim hizaharu b'divreichem, wise people, be careful how you say things. And I think that applies to all political camps, but I guess there aren't many wise people in many political camps.
Well, and possibly accept that last statement. You also did that very well, very carefully done. Ivan.
Yeah. You know, the French historian Henri Rousseau used the term the latest catastrophe of describing, he actually applied it to the Second World War, something which happened that is still alive, that still is in our memories, that we cannot study as a historical event. We cannot study Holocaust as just a historical event because we cannot establish a distance between ourselves and the events of that catastrophe. And that makes historians' work much more complex and complicated or impossible sometimes. You cannot distance, so you cannot study Holocaust as a historian. And what about the revolution? Revolution looks like it's already history. We can establish the distance between ourselves and 1917. We can discuss the different options and discuss the ideology, but at the same time, the whole post-revolutionary history is a part of this latest catastrophe, part of the memory. So when we begin to study the Stalinism, for instance, which is the catastrophe for Russians, and we cannot distinguish between Stalinism and the revolution itself, because the revolution was the immediate cause of the Stalin came to power and its and all the consequences. So this is a situation when the historical event had so many, so much of the influence of the most important traumas of the 20th century. It's actually produced a lot of traumatic experience of the Europeans, not only Europeans, that we still feel that the revolution is a part of our contemporary life. That is part of the answer, maybe. And the second part of the answer is that we still live in the, to the large extent, we live in the world that was constructed during this 20th century in terms of our language, our rhetorical positions, our descriptions of each other, our choice of the constitutive other, as it was like Russia for all Eastern Europe, like the United States and Russia for each other, each other. And we cannot, if you might suggested me to look at the contemporary events, now in the early 2017, we see how American discourse, political discourse, are using the rhetorics which was elaborated during the Cold War. All of this pro-Trump, anti-Trump accusations connected to Russia. Okay, if you look from Russia, it looks like, the Americans just getting back to the Cold War rhetoric, not to the Cold War itself. We don't have a reality of the Cold War. But many of the speeches, articles, positions are just a repetition of what was elaborated during several decades of the competition between Russia and the United States. And this is how the past still influences us. We don't have a language which can describe the new situation. We haven't yet produced the new language. So we use the language of the past to describe what we have now. And we use the language of the Cold War to describe the very new reality. It's maybe ugly, maybe bad reality, but it's a new one. But we don't have a language yet. And that's why we use all of this language, which was a result of our competition or of enmity of the last century. And this is how the revolution and the 20th century still influences contemporary description of the reality. Thank you.
Well, the issue of the Russian Revolution, or multiple Russian revolutions of that period, is more than history for the region, in particular post-Soviet region. For those of you who followed events in Ukraine, what started there started with the phenomenon known as Leninapad, And so demolition of the Lenin statues, which of course is just one of the way to express attitude towards the Soviet legacy, and in parts of Ukraine, again, the monuments were demolished. In others, there were decisions made by the parliament. And then we have the separatist regions where the monuments to Lenin stand. So again, Lenin, as embodiment of that legacy, is very much at the center, for example, of what is happening in Ukraine, or for that matter in Russia, where the government apparently doesn't know what exactly to do with the centenary of 1917, whether to celebrate it, to mourn, to mark. So again, the debate is still on. So it's more than history. It's part of politics. When it comes to the politics here on this side of the ocean, well, certainly the book that was published in 1989 by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, probably is premature. So where the liberalism is under attack, and it looks like that the main challenge comes not from Marxism anymore, but from a different type of ideologies, from the populist politics, including in this country. Cold War was mentioned. I was really surprised to what degree, for example, Russia today is able to use, rejecting Marxism, is able to use the ideas associated with nationalism and conservative values, and some of these ideas coming from pre-1917 history resurrected as a basically transnational ideology. And again, I was really surprised. I never thought that you can use nationalism in that way, but certainly it is being used.
But that's the point, because you have something that you're against, which is the transnationalism of the liberal, new liberal empire, right? The EU, et cetera.
Right. So again, the overall point is that on that level, the long echo of the revolution of 1917 is still with us. You can hear it much louder in the region per se, including in these battles over the monuments. But it is certainly something that is important here as well.
Yeah, Darius, anything?
Let me follow on this image of Lenin monuments falling apart, which I have seen. The question is, what do we replace this Lenin with? My favorite solution comes from a little town in Transcarpathian Ukraine. I think it was 2 years ago. They had a Lenin Street. They made it into Lennon Street. It doesn't cost much, and the hero is completely different. I like it. I like the combination of practicality and a complete change of ideology. I still remember the destruction of the Felix Dzierżyński monument in the middle of Warsaw. I remember, passing along the monument twice a week, every day, and thinking about the man who was one of the biggest killers in the history of Central and Eastern Europe, and he had a monument in the middle of Warsaw. And the monument was removed with a big crane. Everybody thought it was made of bronze, very solid. No, it was empty inside. It fell apart. It was such a symbolic moment of the inner emptiness. Now it's replaced with a nice monument of a poet. This I like too. Słowacki, a 19th century Polish romantic poet. I think it's a good replacement. But on a more serious note, I think what we haven't done, certainly in Poland and probably in some other Central European states, we haven't developed a language which would be a simple language for the popular culture to talk about the communist period. What I see among my students is they have two kinds of languages to talk about it. One is the language of the bloody, godless Bolsheviks, alien force which invaded our country and did a lot of harm. And the second is the language of the comedies on communist Poland. That was an absurd country, funny. And there is nothing between funny and horrible. And I believe there was a lot between funny and horrible, actually. What was in the middle of it, and there is no proper Polish to speak about it. Well, it took 28 years not to develop it. So this is the first task. In terms of what kind of lessons we can have, political lessons, there emerged something in Europe like the anti-totalitarian consensus, well, communism was not criticized enough from the point of view of East Europeans in Western Europe, not in Eastern Europe. There was a sustained effort of Latvians, Poles, Hungarians, Romanians, as soon as they joined the EU, to make West Europeans recognize the crimes of the Stalin's regime and so on, which didn't go smoothly. There was a lot of resistance. I remember myself speaking on the Council of Europe meeting with some of the deputies who were quite surprised by what we present. So I think it's still ahead of us to make it, but it was of course compensatory. It was a reaction to the resistance of West Europeans to accept it. However, there emerged something like an anti-totalitarian consensus that Europe is about being against both the fascist, the Nazi regime, and the communist regime. It's a negative basis, but still it's a basis. The question is, what was the worst thing in the totalitarian regimes? And for some people, it was alien, Russian. It was the Russian Empire. Okay? But there are some other reasons to reject it, such as it was a multi-party dictatorship. It was an inefficient economy which wasted a lot of resources, including several generations of human efforts. So I think being more specific, why Europeans accept as a basis the rejection of totalitarianism, what specifically was wrong about it, and not necessarily imported, what had domestic roots and was wrong. And one of it is that the idea of the rule of law, which was abhorrent to Bolshevik and all the communists because it limited the power of the Politburo, and now is under fire. I think the main attack in Poland and in Hungary is against the independence of judiciary and the rule of law.
Right.
And I think this is what is threat. Maybe we have not talked enough about the desire of the communists in all of Europe, not only in Russia, but later on also in Central Europe, to abolish the division of powers and all the checks and balances, anything that would limit the power of the Politburo.
That's actually a really fantastic point, Darius, and I think to Ivan's point as well about the American Cold War lexicon, is that, yeah, if you're not specific about exactly what it is that you're against, then you risk the impression that the thing you're against is something like just Russia, right? And we have kind of that problem now, right? Like, heaven forbid someone should talk to a Russian. I don't know, some of you might have noticed there was a panic about that a few weeks ago. Okay, we have lots of time for questions, so put your hands up high. Make sure you identify yourself and your affiliation, end your question with a question mark, and wait for me to call on you and for a microphone from one side of the room or the other. So we'll go Michael here.
Sure.
And if you keep your questions short, we can make sure to get all of them.
I'll try. I'm Michael David Fox from Georgetown. Unlike Matt, I'm a historian and I'm not obliged to talk about policy relevance. So I feel obliged to point out that much of what you're talking about, the legacy, is not the legacy of the revolution itself, but of its results, communism, which ended in '91. It struck me that I want to pick up on Zvi Gittelman's interesting thought, which strikes me as somewhat a direct result of the revolution, that the notion that one of the results of the revolution, the most consequential results, can be seen as its reaction to it, and in particular the idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, which was alluded to by also Serhiy Plokhy and Darius Stola. It strikes me that this went way back before the revolution. If you think that the pogroms happened first in 1881 with the assassination by revolutionaries of the Tsar, that they occurred again in 1905 when there was the first revolution. And that they were part of Russian nationalism. Then you have the transfer to the incipient Nazi party after 1917, in part by emigres from the Russian Empire and the export of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So there's a Nazi idea of anti-Bolshevism. And then the third is this sort of popular Judeo-Bolshevism that emerges in places like Yedvabna and the Baltics. I wonder if it's a history of Judeo-Bolshevism can be written, and if it has been written, I just don't know about it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Why don't we take, since we'll go back to the panel as a whole, why don't we take 2 or 3 questions together and then come back? Yes, right here. And keep your hands high, because otherwise it's hard for me to see you. Okay.
Very quickly, I wanted to express condolences to Ivan about the recent terror in St. Petersburg. But my question is, when I grew up in the Soviet Union...
Sorry, and you are?
Victoria Feinberg.
From?
I retired from the Department of Defense.
Great, thank you.
When I grew up in the Soviet Union, when a child was born to one parent Russian, another Jewish, the parents wrote him or her down as Russian. If parents were Russian and Ukrainian, I grew up in Kharkov, the child was Ukrainian. So I'm curious how these policies or practices of giving the child the most advantageous nationality at that time affects today's statistics of Russians in Ukraine and the policies and the sentiments.
Great, okay, and yes, the gentleman right here. And I'll come back around for another round. Would you stand up? The camera has asked.
Absolutely.
Thank you. You're all on video, so be eloquent and charming.
Thanks for the warning. Tom Dickinson, National Security Studies Program alumnus from Georgetown University. Very practical question. Tomorrow we will commemorate the 100th anniversary of the U.S. entry into World War I. So I'm wondering if there's any connection or any impact that the Russian Revolution had on U.S. participation and the U.S. role in World War I. The Russian army was on the verge of total collapse at that time, and then the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Did that have any impact on U.S. participation role in World War I?
Great, appropriate question to ask in the Wilson Center. All right, so we have Michael's question, the Judeo-Bolshevism, the legacy of selective national, what do you call it, the ethnic identities, and then the U.S. entering World War I. Who wants to start?
We can.
A
Darius,
little note on Judeo-Bolshevism, because that was the favorite argument of the anti-communists in interwar Poland. And certainly there was an overrepresentation, as we said, of Jews in the Communist Party, but still the communists made a tiny minority among the millions of Polish Jews. However, analyzing the wave of pogroms in the summer of 1941 between the Baltics and the Black Sea, because you have it in Bessarabia, you have it in Poland, you have it in Galicia and the Baltic states, is that only in a minority of localities where Jews lived, you have such pogroms. So you have a widespread prejudice against the Jews that they tend to do Bolsheviks. But at least in the Polish territory, by a recent research, it was below 5% of the localities that had some not large-scale pogroms, even any anti-Jewish violence in this wake of retreating Soviet army in the vacuum before the German army arrived. So you have something widespread, but it only sometimes translates into violence. So there is no direct, of course, is a necessary condition to happen, but it's not a sufficient condition to happen. Just a little footnote.
Sorry?
With regard to nationality, it's an important question. And in case of Russians and Ukrainians, there is a lot of confusion coming from the first imperial census of 1897. Which gave 1 million Russians and 1 million Ukrainians in the cities. But what that really meant, if you are, in our today's understanding, ethnic Ukrainian, but you're in the city and you already read newspapers, you are Russian. So basically you are part of higher culture, Russian culture. And that changes certainly after 1917. For example, someone like ethnic Russian like Brezhnev puts himself in the 1930s and 1940s as Ukrainian. Because that meant within that particular republic, that was advantageous for him to be listed as a Ukrainian. And passport nationality was there exactly as you said. You could choose only between the two, the nationality, the official passport nationality of your parents. And then, of course, people were thinking strategizing about that. What we have today in Ukraine in 2001, actually, it's not the census of 2001, it's not passport nationality anymore. For the first time, we have real figures. Again, it's a dated information, but real figures in a sense how people actually thought about themselves and how they viewed themselves. It's still many people are uncomfortable with the choices that they're given. In the 1990s, a lot of people preferred, especially in Eastern Ukraine, to give Soviet as their nationality. And today, significant percentage of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, they would prefer to have a choice of listing themselves as Russians and Ukrainians at the same time. So the idea of exclusive nationality still makes quite a few people uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just continuing what Sergei said, that's people today also strategize at some point, to some extent, and it's also that's their own choice mostly, and because we don't have anymore in Russia as well passport nationality, and during the census people can say whatever they wanted without documentary, so it's their identities they want to express. So it's much less bureaucratically regulated right now, and that's why. But still, I think people sometimes strategize, and I know many people in Russia with Ukrainian family names list themselves as Russians, and this is how how it works. But I don't see, at least in the Russian-Ukrainian, I don't see that as a political choice. But when there are also Muslim or North Caucasian origin people, there is much more. Charged difference, and this is something which can have much more of a much more of a consequences for a person to be listed as a Chechen, for instance. It's a different story. Well, and answering the question about the entering of the First World War, yes, the United States Woodrow Wilson in his war speech in the Congress actually mentioned the Russian Revolution as a pretext. He said before the Russian Revolution there was a alien war between two imperial alliances, but now we can see that there is an old outdated monarchies of Germany and Austria-Hungary fighting against the alliance of democracy or democracies, Great Britain, France, and now democratic Russia. And that's why we know there is no choice for the United States but to enter this League of Honor, he told it, League of Honor, and that was, Russia was a member of that. And then, but then after the Bolshevik Revolution, especially after Bolsheviks withdraw from the next year and almost a year after the Americans entered the war, that was actually the change of attitude. And yesterday somebody at our conferences quoted that Americans with much frustration met the Russian withdrawal from the war, because it meant actually that more Americans will be killed on the battlefield. So that was one of the reasons why Americans were very unhappy with Bolshevik coup d'etat or Bolshevik revolution, if not yet on the ideological reasons.
Ivan, what was the date of the first American expeditionary intervention in the Russian Civil War?
The expedition was in late summer or early autumn of 1918.
Okay.
It
So
started,
a year,
it mostly,
after.
year after that.
Okay.
The question that Michael David Fox raised, one of the things that historians like to do is to say, you think X started in 1920? I can show you that it goes back to 1820. And, you got to make a living and you got to get a job. So, but you're absolutely right. Of course, the idea of Jews as radicals goes back well before 1917, well before communism. It's said that there was a headline in a Russian newspaper in the 1880s that 9 revolutionary radicals have been arrested in St. Petersburg. 11 of them are Jews. So, this association has long been there. And who influenced whom and how and so on, that's a question for investigation. But I think there was a particular kind of Jew who became a radical, and this was a kind that I call doubly alienated. These were Jews almost to a person, almost without exception, who for a variety of biographical reasons were alienated from the Jewish community, Jewish tradition, Jewish life. Certainly they were not religious Jews, as were the vast majority and the most understudied group of Jews by historians, namely what we call in America Orthodox Jews. They were not Zionists. They did not know Yiddish. Many of them spoke only Russian or Ukrainian. They did not know Hebrew, that's for sure. And when they found themselves trying to enter a Russian milieu, they found themselves, to their great consternation, identified as Jews. And that goes all the way through, for example, the 1950s and the purge of the cosmopolitans. And I think, and this is pure psychological speculation, that they took refuge in the idea of internationalism, of a world without ethnicity, of a world without religion, which is exactly what Marxism had proposed, so that it didn't any longer matter. As Trotsky once replied to Vladimir Medem, the leader of the Jewish Socialist Bund, who asked him, "Tavarish Trotsky, are you a Jew or a Russian?" "I am not a Jew, I am not a Russian, ja Sozialdemokrat, ja Internationalist." And I think he meant it sincerely. And that's an interesting theme to discuss when we talk about the legacy of the Russian Revolution. And my colleagues have addressed that, namely the tension between an internationalist vision and an increasingly nationalist identity and reaction to internationalism, which we see today in many parts of the world.
Fascinating. You know, it occurs to me as I listen to these comments that the revolution for almost whoever, Russian government today, former captive nations, the Jewish community, whoever, probably even the individual family members of famous revolutionaries, is probably the most disowned event in history. I mean, even Nazi Germany is sort of forced upon, in terms of ownership of it, forced upon Germans by the Western occupation. It's amazing how everyone gets to say, well, this wasn't really our thing. Okay. We have plenty of time for additional questions, so we'll go down the list. Eric, I saw you. Why don't we go start in the back with Eric Lohr there? And we'll come forward here.
So why study the Russian Revolution?
Can you stay standing for the camera?
Stay standing, okay. Eric Lohr from American University. So why study the Russian Revolution is the question on the table. And the easy answer is that it's not over yet. And to think about this, I was just thinking that the fact that the Bolsheviks won in October sometimes gets in the way of thinking about this question, because there have been 4 revolutions in the 20th century in Russia. Leon Aron has convincingly argued that 1991 was also a revolution. And 3 out of the 4 were very comparable to other liberal constitutional revolutions. And if you think of the history of all of those revolutions and their legacies, it took a long time. In France, there was a big one, and then there were several smaller ones, Restoration, Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. The United States, we had our revolution. It was really only consolidated with the Civil War that looks a little bit like a revolution. The Civil Rights Revolution in the 1960s has been called a Civil Rights Revolution. So maybe, if we think in this broader context, the really important revolutions were 1905, February 1917, 1991. And in that sense, it's not over yet.
Wow. So you're going the opposite direction from Michael. Historians just aren't comfortable with fixed dates, clearly. The gentleman here in the yellow shirt.
The question, why study Russian Revolution? I guess one of you guys mentioned Ayn Rand, and my question specifically is, don't you think that Ayn Rand's prediction essentially came true, that United States is already in a form of socialism, probably ideologically, not de facto socialism, but for example, the media and the institutions of higher learning, like colleges, and they are essentially like Bolshevik propaganda machines these days. And examples abound. Obviously, what did the Bolsheviks do? They crushed the opposition. That's what they're doing to white Christian males, that they want to eliminate this white Christian males as a class, just like the Bolsheviks wanted to eliminate certain like bourgeois and the landlords and so on. Okay. So the question again is, don't you think that the Russian Revolution and Marxism essentially has had a tremendous impact on United States? And it's just the way of saying it. I guess you have to be born in the Soviet Union to see this disease, because if you haven't had this disease, you won't recognize the symptoms. And essentially, my prediction is that maybe 20 or 30 years from now, the United States will be in de facto socialism.
Okay. And then right here, yes. Just right here. Okay. The previous questioner from Moscow, former Ditra. Yeah, right here.
Hi, I'm Ron Bookbinder, and unaffiliated.
Okay.
Forgive me for asking historians a counterfactual question,
Oh, those are the best kind.
but what if the Bolshevik Revolution had not happened and the provisional government from the February Revolution prevailed, or even the Mensheviks? How do you think that would have impacted Russia, East Central Europe, the Jews, relations with the United States?
Great. Didn't Newt Gingrich write a book about that? I think? Okay, great. So we've got the revolution's not over yet, Ayn Rand, and the counterfactual. Who wants to start? Ivan,
I
you
can
look-
start with Ayn
please.
Rand, yeah, and yeah. Of course, it's a question for you Americans. I'm not here to judge if America is becoming socialist or not. But just you reminded me a couple of stories. One story is from the second half of the last century. Here in probably quite a few of people present remember Marion Barry. Yeah, the mayor. He had his, as his second name, he used the family name of the Russian communist newspaper Pravda chief editor, Shipilov. He is Marion Shipilov Barry. He used it. Yeah, you can look up in the Wikipedia somewhere. Yeah, Shipilov. Because he was a young propagandist or a young left-wing propagandist in the college, and he was nicknamed Shipilov after the Soviet chief propagandist, and he used it as a document. So his second name was Shipilov. So there is a kind of about influence of communism on American politics. Well, on the DC, and. So there are much more of this type of anecdotes in our decision. But what I see, probably because of the Cold War, because of the competition I was talking in the very beginning, the word socialism in the United States was always marginalized. It's something that was very bad. It's not Nazism, but it's close. It's something which you cannot. But what we see now, there is no more world communist system so much. And so we see that some of the well-established politicians like Bernie Sanders started to use word socialism without fear. And this is a new development. This is a big distance from this and to making the United States a socialist country. The United States is much farther from socialism than any European country or Canada, so I don't see immediate danger of you to being. But there is some change. There is some change in the attitudes, and it is interesting that all of this recent heated debate in American, Russian interference was about Russia, but not about communism. It's an interference of another power, but not of the alternative ideology. And this is a very interesting change of the discourse here in the United States. We will see how it will develop. I'm sorry I cannot answer the counterfactual. As a historian, I hate it, but it's sorry about that. Thank you.
Anyone on? Yeah, Darius?
Counterfactual. Actually, I think your question is good because it shows how important it was an event. That means the consequences were also multi-directional. That even analyzing I immediately thought about how Finland, Baltic states, Poland, Romania would have reacted to the White Russians, actually winning the civil war. What would be the consequences? And now it's like imagining what would be the decision of your opponent when you play chess. 25 movements ahead, you have too many possible options. But I think it rightly stressed the importance of the Bolshevik coup d'etat. I mean, it was a coup d'etat with dramatic consequences in so many fields. I'm not afraid of United States becoming the Norway of North America or Sweden. I've been recently to Norway. Doesn't look bad, actually.
Maybe I'll take. Sorry, go ahead.
But do Zvi and then Sergey.
Okay, thanks. I'll take up your challenge because I'm not a professional historian, so I don't have to worry. I think the answer to your question, what if the provisional government had lasted, lies in your views of two things: political culture and international relations. And political culture, I think, would argue against the evolution of a democratic regime in Russia. Not because I believe that the Russian people are genetically incapable of democracy or anything like that. But if you look at the countries around the Soviet Union in the interwar period, you will notice that almost all of them began as democracies. Whether it was Poland until 1926, the Baltic states until the mid-1930s. Hungary may be an exception, though there were a few months at the very end of the First World War where it was democratic. There was only one country that became a stable democracy, and that was, of course, Czechoslovakia. All the rest, having been mandated to become democracies and having had democracy perhaps put on them from the top, never sustained democracy because there was no grassroots support for it. And we can talk a great deal about why there was not such support and what are the prerequisites, economic, social, and cultural, for democracy. But it seems to me our experience between 1991 and 2000 in Russia, and then between 2000 and 2017, strengthens the point that without a tradition, without a commitment to certain values, and without a very, very strong, sustained, and respected and successful governmental experience in democracy, it is not the natural default position of societies. Democracy is a freak. Democracy, if you look at world history or if you look at the globe today, is not the norm. It is the exception. And there's no reason to think, I think you would be hard-pressed to make an argument that had the provisional government lasted and had the Constituent Assembly taken place, that in the longer run, what had been the Russian Empire would have evolved into either a democracy or a series of democratic states.
To Eric's comment, I agree that the Bolshevik coup overshadows the rest of Russian history and region's history of the 20th century, and those multiple revolutions that you mentioned that have to be studied on their own, which would make our understanding of Russian history better. I would also add to that that with so many revolutions out there, maybe the topic that deserves also close attention is quote-unquote counter-revolution. And that's with all the attention going into the revolution and counter-revolution being really delegitimized by Dzerzhinsky and then people after him, we really don't look at the reaction to that revolution in many ways, and that's a huge gap there. In terms of counterfactual, again, I think that one can. I don't think it's very productive to think that the October coup would not happen. But what would be more likely, let's say, what if the volunteer army, the Denikin army in 1919 actually would get not just to Tula, but would get all the way to Moscow, which was a possibility.
Kornilov would take power.
Right. So that's only to a degree counterfactual. That was in the realm of possibility. And again, I would agree with that. Again, I don't see alternative to emergence of some kind of authoritarian regime as part of counter-revolution to the kind of revolutionary developments of 1917 that happened. Thank you.
You know, there's if you go on my Twitter feed at least, you'll find there's while we're in the realm of sort of history as entertainment, there's a survey that you can do now that tells you who you would have been in 1917 based on a series of very silly artificial questions. And my answer to the counterfactual about the provisional government, what if it had lasted, is apparently I would have been in the provisional government because I'm basically a slightly less authoritarian cadet is where I came out. But, let me ask for very quick, we've got just less than 5 minutes left. Let me just ask the panel to close with an observation, if you can, on this question. Since we are an institution of scholarship, 100 years in retrospect, we have much more, research-based knowledge. We have, cumulative generations of analysis and historiography. We have different political contexts and lenses through which the revolution has been studied. But we are also now, by definition, other than a few very long-lived people, more than a full human lifetime away from this event. I mean, this event is really, really a long time ago. So I wonder if you could assess, I don't mean it as a black or white yes or no question, but can you assess the quality of our understanding of this event and of this time, today, and what you expect it to be in the next 100 years? If you think that this is going to fade to essentially being something like, I don't know, some distant era in history, or is it going to retain resonance? Is it going to be really well understood? Is it going to be appreciated in each of the contemporary ways that you've mentioned, or not?
Should we quote Mao Zedong? It's premature to assess the French.
Yeah.
I think we know today more than we knew 20 or 30 years ago, and the major shift is happening given the fact that the Soviet Union, that was a bearer of particular ideology, is not there anymore. So preoccupation just with the Bolsheviks, preoccupation just with the twists of the Marxist either ideology or tactics is gone, which allows us to look actually at the phenomenon of the revolution in a much broader context and raise other questions. So I think we are better understanding it today than we used to. And with regard to the future, again, I think that the importance that had been paid specifically to Marxism or to Bolsheviks will be less there, and other questions will be there as well. Putting the revolution into a context which it lacked for a long period of time, like the context of the World War I. So that's extremely important. The disintegration of the empire and reassembling of the empire, the theme that again appeared relatively recently and was not part of the focus on the revolution before that. And I'm sure our successors, as they will be applied for tenure positions, will find another very interesting questions to discuss and research. So I'm optimistic.
You and I are thinking along the same lines. The subtext of my question is future Kennan fellowships, so pay attention. Anyone else, including Ivan?
Yeah, there are of course two possible answers, and one is that yes, we learned something during those 100 years about the Russian Revolution. But just recently the Russian Revolution ceased to be the immediate, instant past, and we can establish the distance. I mentioned that distance, which is a prerequisite for any historical research. So we just in the beginning of the studying the Russian Revolution as some past event, not historical event, not just something which are still here. But the other part of the answer is that the nature of historical knowledge is not just a knowledge, cumulative knowledge, which is a part of it, but also it's a dialogue. There is also a dialogue. We put the questions from our current lives, current agendas, current political, social. We always we look in the past, some explanation of what we are, where we are. So we cannot predict which agendas or which problems we'll face, we tomorrow or our successors, and that's why they will definitely ask the events of 1917 some very interesting, new and unpredictable questions, and we'll know much more. Thank you.
I think the answer to your question will be different in the United States and in Europe, and especially in East Central Europe, and for two reasons. The Russian Revolution had a more direct and perhaps lasting impact on East Central Europe and on Russia itself, or the Russian imperial territories. And therefore, it's not merely history, it's personal biography, if not of yourself, then certainly of your immediate family and its predecessors. For the United States, it's at a geographical remove, and the impact has to be thought about rather than be heard within the family circles. But the second reason has to do with the different cultures of the areas. In the United States, as my fellow Michiganian Henry Ford once said, history is bunk. As I tell my students, and they prove it to me every day, the American historical memory goes back to the day before yesterday. Whereas in Europe, and especially in East Central Europe, there's a surfeit of memory. I mean, the Serbs and the Kosovars are fighting about something that happened more than 600 years ago. And Kosovo is important because to the Serbs because they lost.
Right.
What people is so proud of what they lost? So I think that politicized history is much more a phenomenon in East Central Europe. And it will continue to be an issue and a subject for study more so than in North America.
Man, what I love about these panels we have here, it's like bumper bowling. And no matter how off the mark my question is, I'm always going to knock down some fabulous pins. So please join me in thanking this incredible panel. And so we have a coffee break now right outside, and then Audrey Altstadt will bring us together at 11:15 for the next panel.